In the heart of a raging snowstorm, a rugged man in his mid-30s, Luke Miller, found his quiet evening disrupted by a desperate plea for help. What happened next would change both their lives forever. The storm outside howled, snow pelting the windows of Luke Miller's cabin. Inside, Luke, a man with dark hair and a beard, had just finished his work and prepared to relax by the fire. A soft knock echoed through the silence. Confused, he opened the door to find a wild Mustang standing in the snowstorm, its coat covered in snow, and a deep, visible wound on its side. The Mustang's desperate eyes met his, silently begging for help. Without hesitation, Luke stepped aside and let the horse inside, unaware that this simple act of kindness would change both their lives forever. Inside the cabin, Luke closed the door behind them, cutting off the harsh wind and snow from the outside world. He quickly moved to the fire, grabbing a blanket from the couch and draping it over the Mustang, who was still trembling. The horse's body was painfully thin. Its ribs were clearly visible through its fur, and exhaustion was evident in the way it stood, its legs shaky and struggling to maintain balance. But there was something else, something deeper. There was a look in its eyes, a silent plea for something more than just shelter. Luke knelt down beside the Mustang, his rough hands gently brushing through its matted mane. The horse flinched at first, clearly wary of the human who had brought it inside, but after a few moments, the Mustang slowly relaxed, settling into the warmth. The air inside the cabin was much warmer than the freezing storm outside, but the horse's condition was far worse than Luke had initially realized. The storm was violent, the howling wind still strong against the walls of the cabin. Luke glanced out the window, watching the snow swirl outside, but his attention quickly turned back to the Mustang. The horse had clearly been through much more than just a snowstorm. Its coat, though now covered with melting snow, revealed the thinness of its body. Luke couldn't help but feel a deep pang of sympathy. He quickly went to his small first aid kit, pulling out bandages, antiseptic, and gauze. As he knelt beside the Mustang, he noticed a deep wound along its side, right beneath the fur. The gash was not fresh, but had been there for some time, the surrounding fur matted with blood. The sight of it made Luke's stomach turn. How had this animal survived in such harsh conditions, alone in the wilderness? He cleaned the wound carefully, taking extra care not to hurt the Mustang further. The horse flinched once, then remained still, as if it had resigned itself to the care. Luke's mind raced as he worked. He had no idea what had happened to the Mustang before it came to his door, but something told him it wasn't just a random encounter. The animal had come to him for a reason. As Luke worked, he spoke softly to the horse. "You're safe now," he muttered, though he wasn't sure if the Mustang understood his words. But there was something in the way the horse responded, a shift in the air. It was subtle, but Luke could feel it. The tension between them slowly began to fade, replaced with something deeper, trust. Once the wound was cleaned and bandaged, Luke stepped back. The Mustang was still breathing heavily, but its condition seemed to stabilize, at least for the moment. Luke couldn't help but admire the horse's resilience. Despite the trauma it had endured, it was still standing. The man leaned against the wall, his mind racing with questions, but one thing was clear. He couldn't let the horse return to the storm. Not like this. As the storm raged outside, Luke took a seat beside the Mustang, watching it carefully. The horse, though still thin and weak, seemed to be settling into the warmth of the cabin. Its breathing was heavy but steady. Luke's hand rested gently on the Mustang's side. The bandaged wound was still visible but no longer actively bleeding. The cabin was quiet, save for the crackling of the fire, and the tension that had filled the air earlier seemed to fade. But Luke knew that the Mustang's struggles weren't over. He had done what he could for the immediate injury, but the horse's survival depended on more than just medical care. The Mustang needed food, rest, and time to heal. Luke had seen the way the horse's body had trembled earlier, weak from hunger, exhaustion, and perhaps more. There was something about the Mustang's demeanor that felt familiar, like it was a survivor, like it had been through more than just a storm. But Luke couldn't place why he felt that way. Riley, Luke's dog, sat nearby, her eyes fixed on the new arrival. She had been quiet ever since the Mustang had entered the cabin, but now her tail gave a slow, uncertain wag. She cautiously approached the horse, her nose twitching as she sniffed the air. The Mustang's head turned, its eyes locking with Riley's for a long, silent moment. Luke watched closely. He had always trusted Riley's instincts, and she was showing no signs of aggression. But there was still a sense of unease. Something about the way the Mustang carried itself. It was a wild animal, after all, and wild animals didn't easily trust humans. But it wasn't reacting aggressively, just cautiously. And maybe that was a good sign. After a few minutes, the Mustang lowered its head as though it had made a decision. It let out a soft, almost inaudible snort, and the tension between the two animals seemed to lessen. Luke sighed and released the breath he hadn't realized he had been holding. His gaze returned to the Mustang's wound. He had treated it, but there was still a long road ahead for this animal. Luke couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this horse's story than met the eye. It had appeared at his doorstep in the middle of a violent snowstorm. Too many coincidences for his liking. "Where did you come from, huh?" Luke murmured, running his fingers through the horse's mane. The Mustang flicked an ear, but didn't pull away. It seemed to accept his touch now, no longer as skittish as it had been. The quiet bond between them deepened in that moment, a shared understanding forming in the stillness of the cabin. Luke had grown up around animals. He knew their behaviors, their instincts. But this horse, something about it was different. The Mustang's coat was covered in snow and matted with grime, the layers of ice and dirt showing how long it had been out in the storm. It had survived against all odds. Luke had no idea where it had come from or how far it had traveled, but it had clearly been through more than just a single night of snow. His thoughts turned inward. This Mustang needed a heal, but there was no telling how long it would take, and the storm didn't show any signs of letting up. He turned to look out the small window of the cabin. The wind howled against the walls, rattling the panes. The snow outside continued to fall heavily, a blinding sheet of white that made the world beyond the cabin's walls look like a frozen wasteland. Luke had no doubt that the Mustang would have died out there in the storm if it hadn't found his door. But why had it come to him? Luke ran a hand through his hair. The questions were overwhelming, but they couldn't be answered just yet. For now, his focus needed to be on the Mustang's recovery. Everything else would come later. He stood up and walked to the small kitchen, retrieving a few scraps of food he had left over from dinner. He hadn't planned on feeding a wild horse tonight, but he knew it was necessary. The Mustang's thin frame needed nourishment. Returning to the horse, Luke held out a small portion of food, gently offering it to the Mustang. The horse lifted its head, eyeing the food cautiously, and then, after a moment, leaned in, sniffing at the food before beginning to eat. Luke watched as it ate slowly, carefully. Each bite was almost like a victory. There was something deeply moving about seeing the horse eat, something about the resilience it represented. The Mustang had found its way into this cabin, found its way into Luke's life, and in some strange way, it felt like the beginning of something important. A few days passed since the Mustang had arrived at Luke's cabin. The storm had finally settled, leaving behind a blanket of fresh snow that sparkled in the early morning light. The harsh winds had died down, but the silence that followed was heavy with the weight of the past days. Inside the cabin, Luke kept a steady routine, caring for the Mustang and watching it slowly regain some strength. The horse, once weak and trembling, was now standing tall, though still thin. Its coat, still covered in patches of snow, was starting to regain some of its shine. Luke had been feeding it scraps of food and making sure it had enough water to drink every day. The Mustang seemed to grow stronger, its eyes a little less desperate, its body a little less fragile. But something lingered in the back of Luke's mind, an unspoken question that he couldn't shake. Where had this horse come from, and why had it come to him? It had been nearly a week since the Mustang had appeared at his door, and Luke still had no answers. The horse didn't wear a brand, which was odd for a wild Mustang in these parts. Most of the horses in the area were either owned by local ranchers or roamed in herds far off in the mountains. This one, though, was different. There was something in its eyes, something ancient, almost knowing, that Luke couldn't quite understand. It wasn't just a wild animal. It was something more, Luke spent the next few days trying to care for the Mustang, but a nagging feeling gnawed at him. He couldn't help but wonder what the Mustang's story was, where it had come from, and how it had survived for so long in the brutal wilderness. No ordinary animal would have made it through the storm and the cold, not in the condition this horse was in. One afternoon, Luke was working on repairs in the cabin when he heard a faint whinny from outside. He froze, his tools still in his hands. For a moment, he thought it might have been the wind, but then he heard again, clear this time. Curious, Luke grabbed his jacket and went to the door. He opened it slowly, peering out into the snow-covered landscape. His eyes immediately found the Mustang standing just outside the cabin, its head raised as if listening to something in the distance. Its ears twitched as it looked back at Luke, and then, without warning, it turned and began to walk toward the tree line. Luke's heart skipped a beat. What was the horse doing? Had it recovered enough to leave? He hesitated for a moment, then followed the Mustang, not wanting to let the animal wander off again. As he walked through the deep snow, he couldn't help but feel a sense of urgency. The Mustang was clearly moving with purpose. It led Luke through the forest, deeper than he had ever gone before. The trees towered above them, their branches weighed down with snow. The air was crisp, and the quiet was almost deafening. Every now and then, he would hear the faint sound of the Mustang's hooves in the snow ahead of him. After what felt like an hour of walking, the Mustang stopped at a small clearing. Luke caught his breath coming in heavy clouds of fog. He stood just a few feet away from the horse, watching as it gazed into the distance, its ears forward as if waiting for something. Luke took a few cautious steps forward, his eyes scanning the clearing for any signs of what the Mustang was reacting to. But there was nothing, just the stillness of the winter landscape. Then, as if sensing Luke's presence, the Mustang turned and looked directly at him. There was something in the horse's gaze that made Luke's stomach tighten. It was almost as if the Mustang was trying to communicate something to him, something unspoken, a secret hidden deep within. The horse whinnied softly and took a few steps forward, its head held low. Luke followed it. The connection between them was growing stronger. The Mustang moved through the clearing with a quiet grace, as though it was leading him somewhere, though Luke had no idea where. Suddenly, the Mustang stopped in front of a large rock, its hooves scraping against the snow. Luke looked down at the rock and then back at the horse, wondering what it wanted. He crouched down beside it, his hand brushing against the snow as he looked closer. He noticed something strange, a symbol, faint but visible, carved into the stone. It was a brand, but not one Luke had ever seen before. The symbol was intricate, with sharp angles and lines that seemed to form a pattern. It was unlike any brand that ranchers or wild herds used in the area. It was ancient, almost tribal in nature. Luke's breath caught in his throat. What did this symbol mean? Why was it here, in the middle of nowhere, carved into a rock? He reached out, his fingers grazing the surface of the rock, tracing the edges of the symbol. And in that moment, he felt it, the Mustang's presence beside him, as though it were waiting for him to understand something crucial. Luke stood up slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. He looked at the Mustang, whose eyes were now locked onto his. A quiet understanding passed between them. He had no idea what it all meant, but one thing was certain. The Mustang had led him here for a reason. Luke spent the next few days trying to make sense of the strange symbol he had discovered in the clearing. The Mustang had led him to it, but now he was left with more questions than answers. What did the symbol mean, and why had the horse brought him to that exact spot? The storm had finally passed, and the skies were clear, but the harshness of winter still lingered. Luke had spent most of the day repairing parts of his cabin and tending to the Mustang, but his mind kept drifting back to the clearing and the carved rock. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to this horse than just a lost, abandoned animal. There was a connection between them, a bond that felt deeper than anything he had ever experienced before. That evening, as the sun began to set, Luke sat by the fire, staring into the flames. The Mustang rested in the corner, still weak but more comfortable in the warmth of the cabin. Riley, his dog, lay by his side, her eyes occasionally flicking over to the horse. The silence in the cabin was comforting, but Luke couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease. He was no stranger to solitude. He had lived alone in the wilderness for years. But this felt different. The presence of the Mustang in his life had brought something new, something he couldn't explain. There was a pull between them, something that went beyond the simple act of rescuing an animal from a storm. Luke stood up and walked to the door, his hand resting on the cold handle. He wasn't sure why, but he felt the need to return to the clearing, to the rock with the symbol. It was as though it was calling him, urging him to understand. The wind outside was still cold, but the night was clear, and the moonlight shone brightly over the snow-covered landscape. As Luke stepped outside, Riley followed, her paws crunching in the snow. The Mustang remained behind, its head raised as it watched Luke leave, but it didn't attempt to follow. Luke glanced back at the horse before he began walking toward the clearing. His boots sank into the deep snow with each step. The journey felt longer than he remembered. The once familiar path through the woods now seemed different, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. The trees creaked in the wind, their branches swaying under the weight of the snow. Luke's mind raced as he thought about the symbol, the brand on the rock, and what it all meant. He had never seen anything like it before, and he couldn't shake the feeling that the Mustang was somehow connected to it. When he finally reached the clearing, the moonlight illuminated the area, casting long shadows over the snow. The rock where the symbol was carved stood tall in the middle, its surface cold and slick with ice. Luke approached it slowly, his breath visible in the crisp air. He crouched down and ran his fingers over the surface of the rock, tracing the edges of the symbol once more. This time, as his fingers touched the stone, something strange happened. A pulse of energy ran through his hand, a tingling sensation that traveled up his arm. Luke froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He quickly pulled his hand away, but the feeling lingered. It wasn't just the symbol, it was the Mustang. The horse's presence was felt here, even in the silence of the night. Luke stood up slowly, his eyes scanning the clearing, searching for any sign of what he was supposed to do next. The forest around him was eerily still, but he could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The Mustang had brought him here for a reason, but what was it? Just then, a low whinny echoed through the trees. Luke's heart skipped a beat. He turned toward the sound, but the clearing was empty. The Mustang wasn't there, but the sound lingered in the air as though it was calling to him. Luke stepped forward, his boots crunching in the snow, his eyes scanning the dark forest. He couldn't explain it, but he knew he had to follow the sound. The bond between him and the Mustang was undeniable. It had led him here, and now it was calling him back. He couldn't ignore it. As Luke walked deeper into the woods, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. He was no longer alone. The wind picked up, swirling around him as if urging him to follow. The trees seemed to close in, their shadows stretching long across the snow. The eerie stillness of a night was broken only by the occasional sound of a branch snapping under the weight of the snow. Then, in the distance, Luke saw a figure standing at the edge of a small clearing, just beyond a cluster of trees. The figure was tall, cloaked in shadow. Luke could feel the presence of another person, a presence that seemed ancient, almost otherworldly. The figure didn't move, but as Luke approached, he felt a chill run down his spine. The air seemed to shift, as if something was stirring in the wind. The figure turned slowly, revealing a face, but Luke couldn't make out any details. It was as if the face were just a blur, a shadow within the night. Luke's breath caught in his throat as he took another step forward. "Who are you?" he called out, his voice barely a whisper against the wind. But the figure didn't respond. Instead, it raised a hand and pointed to the ground. Luke looked down, and his eyes widened in shock. The symbol, exactly like the one he had seen on the rock in the clearing, was carved into the ground, glowing faintly in the moonlight. Before Luke could speak again, the figure turned and vanished into the trees, leaving no trace behind. Luke stood frozen, staring at the spot where the figure had stood. His heart was pounding, and his mind was racing with confusion and fear. What was this? Who had he just seen? And why had the figure led him here? A low whinny from behind made Luke turn sharply. The Mustang had followed him, standing at the edge of the clearing, its eyes fixed on Luke with a steady gaze. There was no fear in the horse's eyes, only a quiet, unspoken understanding. The figure was gone, but the bond between Luke and the Mustang had deepened even further. The horse had led him here, just as it had brought him to the clearing, and now something else was becoming clear to Luke. The Mustang was not just an animal to care for. It was part of something much larger, something ancient and powerful. Luke took a deep breath, his hand resting on the Mustang's side. He had no idea what was happening, but one thing was certain. This journey, whatever it was, had only just begun. Days passed, and Luke's life seemed to shift in ways he couldn't explain. The Mustang had become more than just an animal to care for. It was a presence, an undeniable force in his life, guiding him, leading him to places he couldn't understand. Luke had been living alone for so long that the sudden appearance of this wild creature felt like fate, a force bigger than anything he could comprehend. The connection between them deepened. Luke had taken to spending hours with the Mustang, tending to its needs and watching as it slowly regained strength. It was no longer the frail, trembling creature he had found in the snowstorm. The horse's coat, though still thin, was gaining some shine. The once apparent bones were no longer as visible, and the wound on its side had healed, leaving only a scar that faintly marked its history. But there was something else Luke couldn't shake, the feeling that the Mustang was changing him too. He had always been a man of few words, a man who preferred the solitude of the wilderness. But now, with the Mustang by his side, he found himself questioning things he had never thought about before. What was this connection? Why did the Mustang seem to understand him so deeply? One afternoon, Luke decided to take the horse out for a walk. The snow had stopped falling, and the sky was clear, with a soft blue hue that stretched endlessly above. He saddled the Mustang carefully, making sure to check its side for any discomfort. Though the wound had long healed, the horse stood patiently, its head lowered slightly, as if waiting for something. Luke couldn't explain it, but he felt a sense of calm in the horse's presence, something that settled his mind and gave him clarity in a way nothing else had before. The two of them made their way through the snow-covered forest, the silence broken only by the soft crunch of snow beneath the Mustang's hooves and the distant rustle of trees. Luke kept a steady pace, letting the horse lead him, feeling a strange sense of trust in the way it moved. As they ventured further into the forest, Luke felt an overwhelming urge to return to the clearing, the place where he had found the symbol. He wasn't sure why, but it felt like he needed to go back. The strange energy that had filled him that night still lingered, and he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this journey than he had realized. When they arrived at the clearing, Luke dismounted and stood silently for a moment, taking in the sight of the place. The symbol was still carved into the rock, its lines faint but still visible. The Mustang, now more confident and strong, stood beside Luke, its eyes fixed on the symbol. Luke knelt down, his fingers tracing the edges of the design. He had done this before, but this time it felt different. This time, the touch of his hand on the stone sent a strange vibration through his body, a sensation that ran up his arm and into his chest. It was as if the rock itself was alive, as though it was responding to his touch. The Mustang let out a soft whinny, its head turning toward Luke. He looked up at the horse, and for the first time, he understood. The Mustang wasn't just leading him to the rock. It was showing him something that connected the two of them in ways he couldn't explain. Luke stood up slowly, his heart racing. The connection between him and the Mustang had deepened in a way that was almost supernatural. The horse had become more than just a companion. It had become a guide, leading Luke to something he couldn't yet understand. But he knew one thing for certain. The Mustang had come into his life for a reason. This was no ordinary horse, and this was no ordinary journey. The bond they shared was unlike anything Luke had ever known, and he couldn't ignore it any longer. As the sun began to set, casting a golden light over the snow-covered landscape, Luke felt a sense of peace wash over him. The Mustang was still by his side, its presence solid and reassuring. The storm had passed, the world had quieted, but the journey ahead was just beginning. Luke looked out over the vast, snow-covered wilderness, knowing that whatever came next, he wouldn't be facing it alone. The first light of dawn crept through the cabin windows, casting soft rays across the floor. The storm had passed, leaving the world outside blanketed in a pristine layer of snow. Luke stood by the window, his hand resting on the cool glass, gazing out into the wilderness. The Mustang was out there, standing tall, no longer the fragile, trembling creature that had appeared on his doorstep weeks ago. Luke watched the horse move gracefully through the snow, its coat now shining, its once frail body now strong and vibrant. The scar on its side remained, a reminder of the journey they had both been on, but it was no longer a mark of suffering. It was a mark of survival. The bond between them had grown deeper with each passing day. The Mustang no longer saw Luke as just a man offering shelter. It saw him as its protector, its guide through the harsh realities of the wilderness. Luke had never known such a connection before, not even with the animals he had grown up with. This was something different, something rare. And yet, the questions remained. The symbol on the rock, the strange connection he felt to the Mustang, the deep energy that seemed to emanate from the horse. All of it pointed to something greater, but what? Luke stepped outside, pulling his coat tighter against the cold air. He was no longer the man who had closed himself off from the world. The Mustang had changed him. It had opened his heart, made him see the world in a different light. He approached the horse slowly, and as he reached it, the Mustang turned, its eyes meeting his. There was no fear in those eyes anymore, only trust and understanding. It was as if the horse had been waiting for this moment, waiting for Luke to understand what he needed to do next. The Mustang nudged Luke gently, as if encouraging him to follow, and Luke didn't hesitate. He mounted the horse, the saddle fitting comfortably beneath him, and together they walked toward the horizon. The path ahead was uncertain, but Luke no longer felt afraid. The Mustang was with him, guiding him, leading him toward whatever lay ahead. As they moved through the snow-covered forest, the air filled with the quiet sound of hooves in the snow, the landscape stretched out before them, vast and unbroken. The world was endless, full of possibilities. Luke didn't know where they were going, but for the first time, he felt free. He could hear the wind in the trees, the soft rustle of the leaves, and the steady rhythm of the Mustang's gait beneath him. Everything was still, everything was calm. And for the first time in his life, Luke knew he wasn't alone. He had found his purpose, his place in the world, and it was here with the Mustang. The bond between them was unspoken but strong. The Mustang was more than just a horse. It was his partner, his companion, and his guide. Together, they would face whatever challenges came their way. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow across the landscape, Luke looked down at the Mustang. He reached out and stroked its mane, feeling the warmth of its body beneath his hand. The horse slowed its pace, and Luke took a deep breath, feeling a sense of peace wash over him. There was still so much to learn, so much to discover, but for now, they were together, and that was all that mattered. If this story moved you, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more heartfelt tales of resilience and unexpected connections. Share it with someone who believes in the power of bonds that change lives.